Hi, everybody. This is Stefani Rupert. Thank you for joining me for episode number 2 of the Meaning of Everything podcast. Now, the way that this podcast, videocast, normally works is that I will have on guests or we'll be talking about specific content related, we'll be talking about the stuff, the meaty stuff, the good stuff. In the first few episodes, however, if you listen to episode 1, you know this already. In the first few episodes, I want to be talking about this podcast, this series that we're doing, what I'm trying to do, how it all works. And so that way you can always refer back if you want to, whatever you want to get a good idea of what is being offered or why I'm doing it or who I am. That's all here in the first few episodes. So episode 1, I talked all about me, which was very fun for me, probably very not for you. And then here in the second episode, I want to talk about why I believe this podcast is important, what we're trying to achieve here. And then in the third installment of this, in the following episode, I will talk about what the podcast is going to be like, specifically, logistically, what I can offer you, that sort of thing. So without further ado, here, episode 2, I want to talk about our climate, what's going on in the world today. And I'm going to break it down into 2 different pieces. I'm going to talk about the intellectual climate, and I'm going to talk about the emotional, existential climate, what have you. Both of these things are, in some senses, fine, great, and in other senses, in like really dire situations that we need to address immediately. I think it's important. So first, the intellectual climate. I do not know where to start because it's so messed up. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to let this podcast be explicit, so I'm going to refrain from, hopefully you'll understand what words I meant to say. I'll refrain from saying the 4 letters. Our world is really, our intellectual climate is messed up. First and foremost, one of the most problematic things about our intellectual climate is that we don't do a lot of listening. I think that's a problem. And I mean, like, a lot of learning and a lot of listening. I think a lot of people are trying to talk about things that they don't understand, and I'm certainly included in that group, although I make a sincere effort to learn and understand as much as I can. But a really big problem is that people have ideological agendas, right? They're trying to push a specific set of ideas. And again, I know that I'm one of them in some way, but often when people are loyal to an idea, A, they get better publicity, and B, they're really not all that open-minded about what else could be going on. And this is a problem. I see the same thing in my work in the health and mental wellness space. People who like give you a specific answer or a specific solution, or want to tell you, that X number of calories a day or X number of whatever is going to fix all your problems, they're easily marketable. They're going to be able to sell you a lot of books very quickly. And so they're very popular. And we see the same thing in intellectual circles. People who have sort of more simplistic viewpoints get a lot of airtime. They do a lot of shouting. Contention is really popular. People like to shout at one another. And that's really a problem. And I will not refrain from identifying those kinds of things when I see them, and they're everywhere. I could, list some people, but they're everywhere. Some are a little bit better at listening than others. But generally speaking, I think having ideological agendas is a problem. Having a really hard line political loyalties, not being able to understand other viewpoints and where people are coming from is deeply problematic, because A, you're never going to be able to connect. B, you're never going to change anybody's mind, including your own. and see we're not going to like be able to peacefully move forward as a species. So this is all really problematic and something that I would like to work to change, and will participate in a lot of like really good thinking and feeling about, who we are and what it is that we're doing here on this planet. That's one thing about the intellectual climate. Another thing about our intellectual climate is there are there are a lot of people masquerading as philosophers, and this drives me crazy. I'll go ahead and call out one person in particular, Sam Harris. The reason Sam Harris pisses me off so much is that he has stated explicitly that he hates philosophy and the humanities, right? Hates the whatever. In the footnotes of one of his books, I believe it is The End of Faith, the first one, he says that philosophy is just really boring and he doesn't like it. And you find this attitude everywhere. So he's just an example, but this attitude is everywhere. People who are really into the sciences, for example. And then on his website, he calls himself a philosopher, and I can't. I'll say it. I can't even, he calls himself a philosopher. And the reason people do this is because they think that when you like think about stuff or talk about stuff and then write about stuff, you get to call yourself a philosopher, and that's just not true. Philosophy is an ancient tradition. It's an academic discipline, and I will not call myself an expert. And I very much hesitate to call myself a philosopher. Sometimes I will use the word because it's expedient or good for marketing in a particular context, but I will always feel uneasy about it and try to avoid it because I think that's a cultural signifier that we should earn as individuals, but B, I try really hard, but the field of philosophy is just so rich with skills and ideas and histories and nuances, and to consider yourself an expert in it is just, it's mind-boggling to me. I bring this up, this is important because philosophy is where we can find some of our best ideas in history and some of our best feelings and some of our best expressions, and where we can see how our species, how our cultures have evolved over time in terms of how we think and feel and make sense of ourselves in the world. Philosophy and religion is where we see this happening. And so it's a deeply valuable resource and something that we need to appreciate, which brings me to another piece of the intellectual climate that is deeply problematic, which is the division between the sciences and the humanities. Now, I think that I do play already in academia an important role. There are many people here, but not nearly as many as there need to be. Many people who see the value of the sciences and see the value of the humanities and want to bring them together and have them working together. And I will have many people on this show who are at various places in this spectrum and who are working hard to rectify this divide. Right. So as I mentioned in episode 1, I have training in the sciences. My undergraduate degree was in the sciences. I worked in a laboratory studying asteroids and the origins of life on Mars. I understand the sciences and I love them deeply. I have always had a deeply emotional relationship with the sciences. I have a tattoo of some stars. I have a deeply emotional relationship with the sciences, and I love them. And the humanities, I also see their value. The sciences are really good for collecting data, empirical data, repeatable data. That's it, period. That's what the sciences do. And there's a lot of baggage, a lot of, cultural stuff, a lot of tradition and history and psychology wrapped up in the sciences, but that's specifically what science does, is it collects data. The humanities are reflective. The humanities talk about experience. The humanities often tie the sciences together, help it all make sense. And it was in the humanities that we first realized in the history of science when Thomas Kuhn in 1962 wrote the landmark book about how the sciences are always evolving and the standard of truth. We never arrive at a true truth. We have paradigms and they shift. right? We have ideas and coherent theories that make sense, but they don't quite make sense. And then we shift to a new paradigm. And it is with the humanities that we are able to do responsible and thoughtful science and reflect on the data that we get from science. And science can provide data that the humanities can use. And the humanities can take what it knows about human experience, about history, about the quality of life, and use that data, critique it, lend some ideas back and forth about social construction, about how societies function and all that sort of stuff. It should be a very integrated universe, but it is not. It is decidedly not. You will very rarely find an academic or public academic who is willing to see how these two worlds can intersect. I can. And I think that that's deeply, deeply important for understanding who we are as a species. Evolutionary psychology, for example, a lot of interesting ideas it has about like the origin of certain psychological concepts, but without the humanities, it was absolutely blind. People were taking, still are today, taking ideas that they have about our culture or things that we do and finding what we call just so stories, like finding reasons for them to have been a part of our evolutionary history. People in humanities were like, no way. These are parts of our culture. They're not endemic. They're not internal or necessary to who we are as a species. And that was a hugely important critique that came from the humanities. And the humanities can also really participate in teaching us about gene and culture coevolution, gene and culture interactions, trying to figure out like what makes us who we are in terms of nature and culture, and how do these two things interact. And that is perhaps the most important task that we have for ourselves as a species, I think, because we need to understand who we are in order to help ourselves be, again, the best possible versions of ourselves individually and as societies, in order to create systems and methods for us to be the best versions of ourselves. Like, we need to understand who we are and how we become who we are. And for that, we really do need both the sciences and the humanities. And so I will hopefully help us understand these things in this podcast. So those are some things about the intellectual climate. There are more, but those are some of the most important things. And I will hopefully be able to remediate some of them simply with the way that I ask questions, the guests that I have, and will be able to come to solutions that are somewhat unique. I do have somewhat unique theories that will come out over time about what it means to be religious, about what science is, about what it means to be a human being, about what it means to be saved, about how our nature, our biology, and our culture interact. These are some of the things that I work on. And so that will be a piece of what we do here, and hopefully learn a little bit about. So the part 2 of this mini podcast is about our emotional, existential, spiritual, religious climate. A note on terminology. Religion is a heavily laden word. I will have a guest on very soon in the first few guests where we talk about how problematic it is, the category religion. And then spiritual, I dislike a lot for, it has negative connotations in our culture for reasons. But it also, it takes a realm of our lives and sort of separates it from the rest. And you have to elect it. People always say, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And some people say, well, I'm not spiritual. And that's fine. But that's not my favorite way to talk about who we are and how we feel and how we make sense of things in our existence. I prefer the word existential. And yes, I happen to be an existentialist. It was an accident. I didn't know until I was almost 30 that I had been an existentialist my whole life. I was reading Heidegger and I thought, well, crap, it turns out I've always, I believe what Heidegger believes in terms of his metaphysics anyway. I have my whole life and I didn't know it. So yes, I am an existentialist, but I use the word existential to mean like us and our bodies and how we like cope with what it means to be human. So our emotional existential climate, it's a mess, but there is hope. I don't have time here to talk about the history of the human race and specifically of the West. I will a little bit. But we are in an incredibly unique situation emotionally and existentially compared to any other human society that has ever lived. I'm working on a book currently, tentatively titled The Age of Ambiguity. And in this book, I argue that although we have more knowledge than ever before, because we do, we actually have more uncertainty, and specifically an existential kind of uncertainty, an uncertainty about the things that matter most. What does it mean to be good? Is there a God? Is there a soul? Who am I? What am I doing here? How do I make sense of my life? We have more uncertainty in this way than ever before, and it's multiplying, and it's deeply problematic, deeply painful, and we don't know it consciously. But imagine this. So ancient humans making sense of things lived in one tribe. They had themselves, and they occasionally encountered others, but when they did, they just either A, thought they had different gods, or B, maybe thought they were heathens, but they still had their own systems. And before writing was invented, because we need to be very aware. I know this sounds silly, like something that I should be teaching people we need to be aware of. Like there's so much we need to be aware of. Why do we need to be aware of this? But we do. We need to be aware of the intense impact that writing as a technology has had on our culture. The ability to write things down is an enormous game changer in the history of humanity, perhaps the biggest. One of the implications of this is that the types of intelligence that we valued changed completely. Before writing, before we could write things down, before we didn't need our memories, the types of things that we thought about that we wanted to be able to do was our memory. We wanted to be able to remember things. People in ancient history valued retention. They valued quality memorization techniques, quality narratives. These were the types of things that helped them hold on to knowledge. They were holding on to knowledge. And nowadays, what we do is we deconstruct knowledge. We tear it apart. We don't care about memorizing at all. Nobody does it in schools anymore. And we encourage people to be able to take ideas apart and construct new solutions, play with them. They don't have to remember anything. So this was one huge change that happened compared to our ancestral history, compared to who we used to be. And that really set the stage for us to sit with questions in a way that we never did before. And then this huge history evolved with the development of philosophy. And then the printing press was invented and it spread. Writing spread, and then it was available to everybody and not just a select few. And then the sciences developed slowly, and science became this method where our traditional ways of understanding things with narrative and just telling stories and seeing things and making sense of them in the way that we knew how, which is by telling stories, guessing that there were gods or spirits behind things, because how else do you explain something like that? How could people have known? These ways became replaced with data in a sense, or they had to learn how to coexist alongside them. And thus a rivalry between religion and science, religion quotes and science quotes, was born. And the sciences progressively, and the humanities, as people did biblical criticism and learned how to deconstruct these stories that they were reading, over time, these traditional ways of knowing and making sense of things faded and were replaced with data, nothing that was emotionally fulfilling. There's a philosopher nowadays, she's in her 90s, her name is Mary Migley, and the phrase she uses for one thing that happened is God surgery. And many people have talked about this in many different ways, but we cut, as a Western society, God out from our frameworks of how we make sense of things. And then everything had frayed ends. Everything was hooked to God, meaning, value, purpose, solace, everything. We cut God out of it. We cut a lot of things out of it. The sciences have continued. Science is forcing us to question whether we have free will. It's forcing us to question whether we have souls, whether we are complete selves, whether there's any kind of life after death. Science is really radically challenging the types of certainty that humans used to just carry with them naturally. And now we don't know what. And we also live in a globalized world, with thousands and thousands of different kinds of religion. And we're bumping up against them every day. And we no longer have the comfort of thinking that we are the only belief system, the only right belief system. And there's so much knowledge, millions of journal articles published every year. And there's no way we can swallow it all, right? And it's overwhelming. And how do we make sense of it? How do we choose which faith? And how do we know what to do? And now we have so many options, right? In our globalizing world with all this technology, so many options, and they're all changing very rapidly. So we find ourselves in this incredibly unique existential situation that no human society has been in before. And what do we do about it? We have these questions. And they're kind of new. Like, we've been asking them since Plato and before, but they've sort of snowballed. They're tumbling into each other. They're colliding with other questions and other cultures and the sciences. And what do we do? How do we make sense of it? Who are we? We desperately need to be able to make sense of these things, because this kind of uncertainty, like, it has been demonstrated thoroughly that humans do not enjoy uncertainty. We run away from it. Whenever we experience it, we start to desperately seek certainty. And we see this everywhere. We're seeing it in the world, in politics right now. The uncertainty that we're experiencing is frightening. And people are clinging to their safe havens. And we become defensive, right? And maybe we don't know how to cope with it. And so we channel our energies into our egos and our Instagram accounts. Right? We don't want to look at it. We also, all of these questions are deeply important and can feel really good. And we can experience things that are sacred and fulfilling, but we don't look because it's hard and it's scary. And so we ignore it. We shut off the deepest and most important parts of ourselves because we're already hurting, but we don't know why. But I do know why. I think I know why. And I know a lot of people who are exploring why. And we can solve these problems. We can start to work through why we feel the way that we do, why we're in pain, why we're suffering, why we have this, existential despair, and why we behave the way we behave. It's on such a meta level. A lot of the things I talk about with our existence and our being and our metaphysics and what have you, but it's also a deeply important part of our lived experience, a part of our sadness and our anger and our anxiety and our experiences of loss. And then the flip side are the moments in which we get to experience joy and happiness and solace and comfort and contentedness, which is vanishingly rare. So that's the emotional climate we're in today, and what I think we can do about it. If you have any questions, do feel free to drop them on Facebook or Insta or what have you. Send me an email. We will be talking about these things at great length for years. And hopefully, again, we will be talking about big ideas, but in a very practical, emotionally, socially important ways. So stay tuned. In episode 3, in the next the final installment of these mini introductory episodes, I will talk more about the kinds of topics that we'll have on the podcast, specifically what I want to offer, and then we'll get going with our really exciting queue of guests. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Take care.